Over the years of playing chess and analyzing games of various players, I've noticed a powerful trick that often leads to easy victories: sacrificing important pieces. This clever tactic throws opponents off balance and appears to involve minimal risk. Let me demonstrate how this tactic can be effectively employed in popular openings, such as the one that starts with pawn to e4, leading to the Akin's defense. By attacking the pawn on d4, we provoke it to advance. Normally, white responds by moving the pawn to d4. However, instead of following the typical moves, we surprise white by sacrificing the pawn on b5. In response to white capturing the pawn, we then play pawn to c5, offering yet another pawn for white to take. At this point, your opponent might find your moves unusual or consider you a beginner, falling into your clever trap. When you play queen to e5, you create a double attack on the king and the bishop, putting black in a winning position. This deceptive tactic can easily mislead your opponent within just a few moves, catching them off guard and forcing them to make critical mistakes, often leading to the loss of material early in the game and ultimately the entire game. White's attempt to counter with queen to d2, intending to capture black's knight, was futile due to the overwhelming attacking position black had across the diagonal. Because I had a strong attack going on, targeting multiple pieces along the diagonal. If the opponent's queen were to move, I planned to capture the pawn on g2 and subsequently capture the rook on h1. And upon realizing the unfavorable situation they were facing, they ultimately resigned. I must admit that I'm not entirely sure about their calculations, but it was clear that my position was significantly advantageous, leading to my victory. The second trap emerges from my favorite bishop's opening, a strategic choice for white. After playing bishop to c4, many opponents tend to respond with knight to c6. You can then opt for pawn to f4, which creates a position reminiscent of the king's gambit or, at the very least, something unfamiliar to your opponents. This element of surprise often catches them off guard and grants you an advantage early in the game. Once you execute pawn takes f4, you further challenge black's position by playing pawn to d4. This move allows you to grab control of the center, putting yourself in a favorable position to advance your pieces. Moreover, your bishop from c1 stands ready to reclaim the pawn on f4, amplifying the pressure on black. As a response to your strong central control and the threat to recapture the pawn on f4, many opponents attempt to hold onto the pawn by playing pawn to g5. However, you can undermine this pawn chain with pawn to h4, effectively splitting up their pawns and creating weaknesses in their position. At this juncture, black faces a dilemma on how to defend their pawn structure. Opting for h6 is not a viable option, as after an exchange on the h-file, black's rook on h8 would be lost. Consequently, some opponents may choose pawn to f6 to try and preserve their pawn chain. While black saves their extra pawn with this move, it plays into your strategic plan. As a member of the Igor nation, you understand that good things come to those who bait. By enticing black to hold onto the extra pawn, you set the stage for a powerful attack. Finally, with the move queen to h5, you position yourself for a play akin to scholar's mate or something quite close to it. The centralized black king becomes exposed, and a checkmate is on the horizon. After the following sequence, victory was achieved through a checkmate, as the bishop cut off a critical diagonal, sealing the win for white in just a few moves. This trap proves highly effective due to your strong central control, the baiting of black to hold onto the extra pawn, and the subsequent devastating attack that leads to a rapid checkmate, or a significant advantage for white. To crush the Scandinavian defense easily, you can follow this strategic plan as white. Start by playing knight to f3, offering black the chance to capture the e4 pawn. Often, they take the bait and play knight to g5, seemingly intending to regain the pawn. Respond with knight to f6, appearing to accept the loss of the pawn while continuing the game. Next, play pawn to d3, creating a situation where the pawn is under attack twice. Despite being a pawn down, black might feel comfortable with an extra pawn, but they could be bothered by your knight on g5, applying pressure. At this critical juncture, many opponents make a grave error by playing pawn to h6. This move, known as the Tennessee Gambit, turns out to be a big mistake. It exposes black's king to a brilliant sacrifice. Knight takes f7. By executing the sacrifice, you fork black's queen and rook, forcing them to capture your knight. Subsequently, play bishop to g6, attacking the black king. If black captures your bishop with their king, you reveal a discovered attack with your queen, leading to a winning position. With this strategic sequence, you expose the black king and secure a decisive advantage, paving the way for a quick and impressive victory as white in the Scandinavian defense. Another popular opening is the Sicilian Defense, and one way to handle it as white is to employ the Smithmore Gambit. This dangerous opening involves sacrificing a pawn, pawn to d4, to gain strategic initiative and simplify your game, making it easier to play. Black responds with knight to c6, and white places the bishop on an active diagonal. Black has various ways to deal with this gambit, but they chose to play pawn to e5, opening up for the bishop and following a standard opening move. White then plays queen to b3, lining up against the vulnerable pawn on f7. Black has to find a way to defend it, but protecting it with the knight from h6 wouldn't work since it would be captured. Instead, black plays queen to e7 in an attempt to safeguard the pawn. However, this move allows white to gain an extra tempo for their attack. White seizes the opportunity and plays knight to d5, attacking the queen and setting up for a potential fork on the c7 square to target the black rook. Black responds by playing queen to d6, aiming to neutralize white's active pieces. At this point, white plays bishop to g5, potentially preparing for the rook to join the attack. Black decides to remove some of white's active pieces by playing knight to a5. However, this move turns out to be flawed, as white takes advantage of the situation by playing knight to c7 check, leading to a sequence of moves that culminate in a beautiful checkmate delivered by two bishops. In conclusion, the Smithmore Gambit can lead to exciting and tactical positions, and this particular game demonstrates how white's aggressive play can quickly become dangerous for black, resulting in a spectacular checkmate orchestrated by two bishops. Here's a trap for black in the Queen's Gambit declined. As white plays the initial queen's pawn move, pawn to d4, black initially accepts the gambit. However, after white plays c4, instead of holding onto the extra pawn, black counterattacks with a gambit of their own by pushing their pawn to f5. White often accepts this pawn sacrifice, pushing their pawn to d4. At first, it may not seem like white is in trouble, but the pawn on d4 restricts the knight's movement to c3, making it slightly annoying. White then plays knight to f3, attacking the pawns on d4 and f5. Black defends the pawn on d4, and now the pawn on f5 becomes bothersome as it threatens to advance. White's usual move is to play pawn to e3, trying to eliminate the pawn on f5 and potentially trade queens to secure an advantage in the endgame. However, black throws a surprise with the in-between move, bishop to b4 check. White responds with bishop to d2, expecting a bishop exchange. But instead of the anticipated exchange, black plays pawn takes e3, forcing white's bishop to capture it. The bishop can't recapture with the f-pawn, or their pawn structure will be ruined, so they usually capture the black bishop on b4. Now, white hopes for a queen trade and a favorable endgame. However, black plays another unexpected move, pawn takes f2, constantly introducing these surprising in-between moves. Now, white's king must move since it's under check. If the king captures the pawn, they lose the queen, so they move to e2. In this position, it doesn't result in an immediate checkmate for black, but it leads to a queen trade. After capturing the white bishop on b4, black gains an extra pawn and exposes white's king in the endgame. This advantageous position allows black to further their attack, often castling queenside and putting pressure on white. In some cases, white may try to go after the pawn on f2 by playing king to e2, hoping to capture it. However, they may overlook that after knight to c2, they will lose their rook on h1, leading to a significant advantage for black. In conclusion, this trap in the Queen's Gambit declined allows black to gain an extra pawn and create a strategically advantageous position in the endgame, setting the stage for a strong attack and potential victory. One of the funniest traps in chess, even effective against high-rated opponents, is the mirrored Sicilian defense. As white, after black plays pawn to f5, you make the mysterious move pawn to h3, a clever preparation to launch pawn to g4. Your opponent might notice your intention and respond by playing knight to f6, believing they have thwarted your plans. However, you proceed with pawn to g4 regardless, and your opponent might capture the pawn. At this point, you play queen to d3, attacking both pawns on h7 and g4. Your opponent realizes the potential threat, as the pawn on g4 cannot advance due to the dangerous queen checkmate on g6. Feeling the urgency to protect their position, they might move their knight back, thinking they have securely solidified their defense. But here comes the masterstroke, you play rook takes h7. Now the tables have turned, and things take a drastic turn for the worst for black. You're attacking their rook, and if they accept the rook sacrifice with any piece, queen to g6 delivers a beautiful checkmate, spelling the end for black. This trap shows how even seemingly harmless moves can lead to devastating consequences in chess. By luring your opponent into a false sense of security, and then striking with unexpected tactics, you can score quick and impressive victories. Let's continue exposing some opponent blunders with another trap as white. If your opponent decides to play the Banco Gambit with pawn to b5, you can seize the opportunity to become the attacker instead of accepting their pawn sacrifices. By declining their offerings, you set the stage for a powerful counterattack. After capturing the first pawn on b5, your opponent may continue sacrificing more pawns in an attempt to create activity for their pieces. However, you remain unfazed and stick to your attacking plan. Instead of recapturing the pawn on b5, you focus on developing your pieces, playing knight to c3. As your opponent takes the pawn on b5, you once again refrain from recapturing and continue with your strategic play. Playing pawn to e4 now, your pawn threatens to advance and drive away their knight. Realizing the potential danger, your opponent may opt to play b4, aiming to kick away your knight while simultaneously winning the pawn on e4. Now, you make a deceptive move, queen to d3, attacking the knight and forcing it to retreat. When the knight returns to f6, your opponent may expect you to continue with a developing move, but instead, you surprise them with knight to d6. Suddenly, it's checkmate. Your knight delivers the final blow, catching your opponent off guard and securing a decisive victory. This trap demonstrates how cleverly ignoring your opponent's aggressive pawn sacrifices can lead to a powerful counterattack and a swift victory. Here's another killer trap, this time from the perspective of black. Your opponent is playing the most common moves, possibly aiming for the Italian game. As black, you start with knight to f6, and your opponent often goes for the fried liver attack, which can be troublesome for beginners. Now, you play pawn to d5, temporarily closing the diagonal. Instead of recapturing your pawn on d5, you stick to your strategy of sacrificing a pawn, and you play knight to d4, moving the knight away. At this point, your opponent might realize that they can easily renew the threat to your pawn by pushing their e-pawn and potentially capturing the pawn on f7. However, you continue with your plan and play queen takes d6. Now, your opponent may contemplate capturing the pawn on f7 to fork your queen and rook. However, you have a subtle yet brilliant move up your sleeve, queen to c6. This seemingly simple move turns the tables, as you are now attacking your opponent's position fiercely. White's bishop can't escape, and the knight is hanging. White might try to defend, but they will find themselves in a desperate situation. They might be forced to capture h8, but then you strike back with queen takes g2, counterattacking their rook on h1. The rook has limited squares available, and you slide your queen back to e4, delivering a check. White's options are limited, and they might play bishop to e2 to cover the king, but here comes the final blow, knight to f3, a nasty checkmate, and White's position crumbles. This trap showcases the power of sacrificing a pawn and launching a relentless attack on your opponent's position. You can swiftly turn the tables and secure a decisive victory. As White, you start with d4, challenging the center. In chess, opponents who are not well versed in opening theory often opt for seemingly safe, passive moves to avoid complications. The Philidor Defense is one such example. Following the usual sequence of knight to c3 and knight f6, the game appears to be heading towards a quiet middle game. However, you have a more aggressive plan in mind. You play pawn g4, sacrificing the pawn to initiate an attack on Black's position. Black captures the pawn, thinking they have gained a material advantage, but you proceed with rook to g1, activating the rook along the g-file and exerting pressure on Black's position. In response, Black retreats their knight, but you continue with natural moves, like bishop c4. Now, Black realizes the potential threat of knight to g5 targeting their vulnerable pawn on f7. In an attempt to protect their position, Black plays pawn h6, not knowing what lies ahead. As the center opens up, you develop your pieces and plan to castle queenside. Black finds themselves stuck, uncertain how to untangle their pieces. They attempt to maneuver their queen and pawn, but they are unaware of your impending powerful sacrifice. With bishop takes f7, you daringly sacrifice an entire bishop, luring Black's king into a deadly trap. The sequence follows with queen to c4 check, king to e8, queen to e6 check, and king to d8. Then, you successfully castle queenside, leaving Black in a paralyzed state. With Black's pieces pinned and multiple threats on the board, the game becomes increasingly dire for them. The looming knight takes e5 further intensifies the pressure. Despite trying to close the g-file with g5, Black cannot escape the impending catastrophe. You deliver queen f6 check to the king, pinning their knight. The next move sees you capturing the rook, sealing Black's fate with complete devastation. The Philidor Defense trap exemplifies the potency of sacrificing material for a formidable attack. Through astute strategic moves and unexpected sacrifices, you gain a significant advantage, and set the stage for a victorious outcome in just a few critical moves. As a final trap for today, let me share one of my all-time favorites, which works against the Sicilian defense. After e4 c5, you play a paradoxical move, b4. It may seem like a strange move, as Black can capture the pawn either with their pawn or with the knight. However, you have a clever plan in mind. If Black captures with the knight or the pawn, it leads to the same situation, where you gain control of the center with c3 and d4, threatening to push the pawn to d5. If Black tries to develop their pieces, you simply push d5 anyway, creating a powerful central pawn structure. Now, you attack the knight, forcing it to move back or to another square. For instance, if it goes to e7, you can continue your attack by pushing d6, putting tremendous pressure on black's position. In one game, white played bishop to c4, targeting black's pawn on f7. Black went after the pawn on d6, trying to develop their pieces. In response, white played queen to e2 check, forcing the king to move. Then came the sinister move bishop to g5, pinning black queen and putting the queen under attack. Black loses their queen, and the game becomes heavily one-sided. White will likely go on to secure a decisive advantage or deliver a checkmate soon after. This trap is a great example of how seemingly unorthodox moves can create significant problems for opponents who are unfamiliar with the opening and its potential pitfalls. Now, it's time for a puzzle. In the given position, it's white's turn, and you need to find the best move for white. Share your answers in the comments, and let's see how many of you can solve it correctly. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated with future videos. Take a moment to check out the other videos appearing on your screen right now. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Take care and peace.